Well, you made it. Sometimes you probably weren't sure, but you've made it to chapter 25. In chapter 25, we're going to learn the last of the tenses. We're going to learn the perfect active and the perfect middle passive, and we're done with tenses. Let me ask you a question in English first. What is the difference between these three sentences? I wrote, I have written, and it is written. What's the difference? Right. The first is describing a simple past action. You say, I wrote. I did something in the past. Now, if you were to say this in Greek, what tense would you use? Right, the aorist. But when you say, I have written, what are you saying? Yeah, right. You're describing an action that was completed, an action that was done in the past, but it's an action that has ongoing consequences, that there's implications that have come out of the completed action and are still true at the present. I have written this, and when we say that, we almost expect someone to draw out those implications, whatever they would be. What is the difference then between saying I have written and it is written? Right, great. When you say it is written, I mean both I have written and it is written, in a very real sense, are describing the same event. If you say it is written, you are describing a past completed action. But the emphasis of it is written is on the ongoing implications of the past event, and saying I have written puts the emphasis upon the actual completion of the event while allowing for ongoing implications. Well, this is exactly what the perfect tense in Greek does. It describes a completed action, and therefore one that's in the past, but it's a completed action that has consequences or implications or is still true at the time of speaking. And what we generally do in first year Greek is reserve the use of the helping verbs have and has to translate the perfect tense. So you say, I wrote for the aorist, and I have written for the perfect. And once you get more comfortable with the perfect, and you may look at the consequence of a verse, and you may say, oh, it is written will become your translation of a perfect. But that's a little on down the line, and we may want to just stick with a have or has right now with the perfect. Okay, how do you form the perfect? And we'll start with the perfect active. Very easy. A couple of new things, but it's not hard. You start with something that's called reduplication. We'll talk about that in a second. And then you use the perfect active tense stem. And in fact, we now are going to know all 6 of our tense stems. And they go present, future active, aorist active middle. Then we're going to have the perfect active. And then the 5th tense stem is the perfect middle passive. And the 6th is the aorist passive, from which is also formed the future passive. And then you have a tense formative. Now, if it's a first perfect, the tense formative is kappa alpha. If it's a second perfect, it's just alpha. But you would expect that, right? Because you go from theta eta to eta in the aorist passive. You go theta eta sigma to eta sigma in the future passive. So the tense formative for the perfect is kappa alpha. If it's a second perfect, it's just the alpha. And then, because it's not an augmented tense, you have primary active personal endings. Let's just talk a second about reduplication. And basically, there's 2 kinds of reduplication. If the stem begins with a consonant, you undergo consonantal reduplication. In other words, that initial consonant duplicates, and then you put an epsilon in between them. So lu goes to lelu, and then leluka. If, however, the stem begins with a vowel, it undergoes vocalic reduplication. Vocalic reduplication looks just like an augment, but it's not the same thing as an augment. It doesn't indicate past time, it indicates completed action. So agapa undergoes its vocalic reduplication, and you get agapa, and then finally agapeka. And so here's your paradigm of luo in the perfect active. Leluka, lelukas, leluke, lelukamin, lelukate, lelukasi. Now there's a couple of things worth noting in this, isn't it? It looks a lot like the aorist, the first aorist, doesn't it? Except you have a kappa instead of a sigma. Except for the third plural. And look what it does in the third singular. Exactly the same thing the aorist does, right? Ka goes to ke. And then common, kate. And then in the third plural you have kasi. The ending actually is nu sigma iota, right? The nu drops out and everything's there. So there you have a little more difference from the aorist. But there's your first perfect active. Perfects actually are very easy for the most part to recognize, especially if the stem begins with a consonant. Because that reduplication just jumps out at you. The only time you get the reduplication is in the perfect, so you see that and you know right off the bat you're in the perfect. Okay, let's switch over to the perfect middle passive. Well, it's straightforward. We're in the perfect, so we still have reduplication, but we're going to use that fifth tense stem, so we're going to be using the perfect middle passive tense stem, and then primary passive personal endings. And so you get lelumai. Now you notice there's two things missing in the perfect middle passive. There's no connecting vowel and there's no tense formative. You know what I do when I see one of these things? The second I recognize that there's no connecting vowel or tense formative, boom, that's it. It's got to be a perfect middle passive. It can't be anything else. There's no other time in the Greek verbal system where there's no connecting vowel and no tense formative. So the minute you see the personal ending stuck onto a stem, you're perfect middle passive. No exceptions. Cool, huh? And in the case of luo, it looks the same in both the perfect active and the perfect middle passive. And so you get lelumai, lelusai. Look at that. The real second person singular ending finally comes through. Whoa! It's so shy. It's so shy. Lelumai, lelusai, lelutai, lelumatha, lelusta, leluntai. And I put the present middle passive there for comparison. And obviously at this point, it is just imperative that you work through all your different tense forms. It's absolutely imperative that you go through the previous word section in chapter 25 carefully. Make sure all your vocabulary cards are updated. It's imperative that you go through that chart in the back of BBG that's got all the words that occur 50 times or more with all their different verb stems and all the different tenses. You just have to go through these at this point. And all that you're saying is, if I saw this form, this inflected form in this tense, would I recognize it? Or do I have to memorize it? That's what you're doing. So go through with your markers or whatever and mark things up so that there's no question what you have to memorize and what you're going to allow the rules to inform you about. And don't forget the 4 category of verbs that form their different tense stems regularly. They are stems ending in iota and upsilon, like luo, contract stems, liquid stems, stop stems, stems that end in a stop. Those 4 categories of verbs are going to form all of their different tense stems very regularly. All right? Very regularly. It is finally time to learn the middle. I put it off as long as I could. Now let me emphasize, 75% of all the middle forms in the New Testament are deponent. Erchomai is a middle deponent. So 75% of all the middles you see are going to be deponent. Of the other 25%, a lot of the words in the middle have almost exactly the same meaning that they have in the active. In other words, the middle is very, very close in meaning to the active. And yet there are some true middles in the New Testament. Now you need to understand, if you had learned classical Greek, the middle would be much more important because it was much more prevalent in classical Greek. But the middle voice is dying out in Greek. And that's why it's not such a factor in the New Testament. You have your subjects and verbs and direct objects. If the verb is active, it means the subject does the action of the verb to the direct object, right? If the verb is passive, then the subject is receiving the action of the verb. If the verb is middle, the subject is still doing the action. The direct object is still receiving the action. And yet the nuance of the middle is that the action of the verb is done in such a way that it also comes back and affects the subject. A verb that is middle, a true middle, describes an action which in some way comes back and affects the subject. The subject is still doing the action. The direct object is still receiving the action. But the verb in the middle describes an action that in some way comes back and affects the subject in a way that an active form doesn't. Now here's one of the best examples I know of. In Mark 11:24 says, Diatuta, for this I say to you, all things whatsoever proseuchiste, there's the deponent, proseuchomai, that you pray and ataste. Okay, what's that from? Ataste. It's from aiteo. Is aiteo deponent? No. What tense is this? It's present, isn't it? You have a present tense form with middle passive endings. Now, you would just instinctively translate this as a passive. Guess what? It doesn't make any sense as a passive. That's your clue that it's a middle. Now, how would you take the verb aiteo, to ask, in the context of a prayer and translate it in such a way that the action of the verb comes back on the subject? You are still doing the praying, but how would you translate it? What's the nuance? It's whatever you ask, whatever you pray and ask for yourself. In other words, in Mark 11:24, we're not talking about praying for other people. We're praying for yourself. If you look at most paradigms of middles, they're going to translate them as reflexive. So luomai would be, I loose for myself. Lue, you loose for yourself. Lue, he, she, it looses for him, her, itself. The only way we can kind of do this in English is reflexive. Now, this is a little advanced, but I need to get this through to you. Normally, in Koine Greek, when the speaker wants to be reflexive, they use a reflexive pronoun. Whoever, therefore, humbles himself as this child, this one is greater in the kingdom of heaven. So normally when you want to say for yourself, it usually is an active verb with a reflexive pronoun. And yet there are some cases, and I got 3 or 4 good illustrations in the exercises, where you have a middle form where the middle nuance is coming through. You see why I waited so long? Well, we don't have anything really like this in English, and so it can be confusing. A verb that is middle is describing an action that in some way concerns or affects the subject. And the only way that we have to express that in English is this for idea with some kind of reflexive pronoun. But remember, 75% of the middles are deponents. So this doesn't happen very often. It will happen when you see a form that is not deponent and doesn't make any sense as a passive. You're going to go, oh, maybe this is a middle. And finally, we are done with the master verb chart, which really should be named the master indicative verb chart, by the way. Well, we have three new lines. First perfect active, second perfect active, and the perfect middle passive.